The autumn wind swept across the wheat fields of Crawford County, Montana territory, carrying with it the scent of harvest and the promise of an early winter. Margaret Hayes stood at the kitchen window of their weathered farmhouse, her calloused hands submerged in a basin of cold water, scrubbing the breakfast dishes with methodical precision. Through the warped glass, she watched her father, Thomas Hayes, barking orders at the hired hands as they loaded wagons with the season's yield. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She was 23 years old, though the mirror, when she dared look into it, suggested someone who'd lived far longer. The left side of her face bore the permanent reminder of the kitchen fire that had consumed their previous home when she was 9. The scars ran from her temple down to her jaw, pulling her skin into an uneven landscape of ridges and discolored tissue. Her left eye, though functional, sat slightly lower than her right, giving her an asymmetrical appearance that made strangers look away quickly, as if her disfigurement might be contagious. "Margaret," her father's voice cut through the morning air like a whip crack. "Get out here and help sort these grain sacks. Or are you too busy admiring yourself in that window?" She dried her hands on her apron and stepped outside, the October sun momentarily warming her face. Her younger sister, Catherine, was already in the yard, her blonde hair catching the light as she laughed at something one of the ranch hands had said. Catherine was 17, beautiful in the effortless way that seemed to come naturally to some women. She'd had 3 marriage proposals in the past year alone, each one more advantageous than the last. "About time," Thomas muttered as Margaret approached. He was a barrel-chested man with a grey beard that he kept trimmed military short, a remnant of his years in the Union Army. "Catherine shouldn't have to do all the work while you dawdle inside like some kind of princess." Margaret said nothing. She'd learned years ago that responding only prolonged the humiliation. Instead, she moved to the pile of grain sacks and began checking each one for tears or moisture damage. Her movements efficient and practiced. "Mr. Hayes," called out James Porter, one of the younger farmhands. "We're short 2 sacks based on the count from the mill." Thomas's face reddened. "Impossible. I counted them myself yesterday." He turned to Margaret, his eyes narrowing. Did you give any grain to those vagrants who came through last week?" "No, father. I turned them away as you instructed. Don't lie to me, girl. You've always had a soft heart for strays and beggars. Probably why God saw fit to mark you the way he did. Punishment for your weakness." The words landed like physical blows, but Margaret kept her expression neutral. Catherine glanced over with something that might have been sympathy, but she said nothing. She never did. "The count was wrong at the mill," James interjected quietly. "I was there when Mr. Henderson tallied it. He admitted he might have miscounted." Thomas waved his hand dismissively. "Fine, get these loaded then. Margaret, go help your mother with the preserves. At least you can't ruin that too badly." Inside the house, her mother, Eleanor, was standing over the stove, stirring a massive pot of apple butter. She was a slight woman, worn thin by years of childbearing and hard labor. She'd given Thomas 6 children, though only Margaret and Catherine had survived past infancy. "Don't listen to him," Eleanor said softly without looking up. "He's worried about money. The harvest wasn't as good as he'd hoped. He's always worried about money, Mother." "That's not why he speaks to me that way." Eleanor finally turned, her tired eyes meeting Margaret's. "He's bitter about the proposals. Each one Catherine receives reminds him that you'll never marry, that he'll have to provide for you until he dies. I could work. I could move to Helena and find employment. A woman alone in the city. With your—" Eleanor gestured vaguely at Margaret's face, unable to complete the sentence. "No respectable establishment would hire you. You know that." Margaret did know that. She'd tried once, 3 years ago, traveling to Butte to apply for a position at a dressmaker's shop. The owner had taken one look at her and suggested she try the laundries instead, where she wouldn't have to interact with customers. The laundry had turned her away entirely, the foreman explaining that her appearance would disturb. The other workers, she'd returned home to find her father, had sold her horse to cover the cost of Catherine's new winter. Wardrobe. The afternoon passed in a blur of domestic labor. Margaret churned butter, mended fences, fed the chickens, and helped her mother prepare supper. By the time the sun began its descent behind the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold, she was exhausted. Supper was a tense affair. Thomas sat at the head of the table, discussing the upcoming winter preparations with calculated precision. Catherine chatted about the church social scheduled for Saturday, where she expected to see Robert Mitchell, the son of the wealthiest rancher in the county. "Robert's father owns over 10,000 acres, Catherine said, her eyes bright. "Can you imagine? They have 40 ranch hands, and their house has 12 rooms. Don't count your chickens before they hatch," Thomas warned, though his tone was indulgent. "Mitchell will want a significant dowry, even for a beauty like you." "I'm sure we can manage something appropriate," Eleanor said carefully. Thomas grunted. "Would be easier if we only had one daughter to worry about." His eyes flicked to Margaret. "But I suppose the Lord tests us in various ways." Margaret focused on her plate, cutting her meat into smaller and smaller pieces until her mother touched her hand gently, a silent plea to ignore the barb. After supper, Margaret escaped to the barn, where she kept a small collection of books hidden in the hayloft. Reading was her refuge, a way to travel beyond the suffocating confines of the Hayes farm. Tonight, she was deep into a volume of Emerson's essays when she heard footsteps on the ladder. Catherine's head appeared through the opening. "I thought I'd find you here. Did Father send you?" "No, I just wanted to talk." Catherine settled herself on a hay bale, arranging her skirts carefully. "Margaret, I'm sorry about what he said at dinner." "You're always sorry. Yet you never say anything when it matters." Catherine flinched. "What good would it do? You know how he is. Contradicting him only makes things worse for everyone. For you, you mean. It doesn't affect you at all, does it? You get proposals and pretty dresses and the promise of a grand future. I get reminded daily that I'm a burden, a mistake, something to be hidden away. That's not fair." "I didn't ask for any of this. Neither did I," Margaret said quietly, closing her book. "I didn't ask for the fire. I didn't ask for these scars. And I certainly didn't ask to be treated like something less than human by my own father." Catherine was quiet for a long moment. "Robert's family is hosting a gathering next month. A harvest celebration. Father received an invitation for all of us. Then you'll all go and have a wonderful time. He insists you come too. He says it would look strange if you didn't, like we were ashamed of you." Margaret laughed bitterly. "He's ashamed of me. He just doesn't want others to know it. Maybe this time will be different." Maybe what, Catherine? "Maybe some kind soul will take pity on the scarred spinster. Maybe someone will be charitable enough to overlook my face." Margaret stood gripping the book tightly. "I don't want pity. I don't want charity. I want to be left alone." She climbed down the ladder, leaving Catherine sitting in the hayloft, surrounded by shadows and unspoken apologies. The next few weeks followed a predictable pattern. Margaret worked from dawn until well after dark, her labor essential to the farm's operation even as her father complained about her presence. She processed the autumn harvest, preserved vegetables for winter, repaired equipment and handled the farm's bookkeeping, a task no one else in the family had the patience or skill to manage. It was during one of these bookkeeping sessions that Margaret discovered the true extent of their financial troubles. Her father had taken out a substantial loan against the property, gambling on a better harvest than they'd achieved. The numbers didn't lie. Without a significant influx of cash, they'd lose the farm within 2 years. She considered bringing this to her father's attention, but decided against it. He'd only find a way to blame her for his own poor decisions. The morning of the Mitchell gathering arrived with unseasonable warmth. Catherine spent 3 hours preparing, trying on different dresses and hairstyles, enlisting Eleanor's help with every detail. Margaret dressed in her plainest frock, a dark blue cotton that had seen better years. She pulled her hair back severely, knowing that any attempt at prettiness would only emphasize what was wrong with her face. The Mitchell ranch was everything Catherine had described and more. The main house was a sprawling structure of imported lumber and glass windows, surrounded by meticulously maintained grounds. Dozens of families had already arrived, their wagons and horses creating a small village in the circular drive. As the Hayes family approached, Margaret noticed how conversations paused, how eyes followed them. Not Catherine. Everyone was used to Catherine's beauty. They were watching Margaret, their expressions ranging from pity to discomfort to poorly concealed revulsion. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Keep your head down. Thomas hissed at her as they dismounted. Try not to draw attention to yourself. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. How could she not draw attention when everyone was already staring? The gathering took place in the Mitchells' enormous barn, which had been decorated with autumn foliage and strings of lanterns. Tables groaned under the weight of food, and a small band played lively tunes in one corner. Young people danced while their elders discussed crops, politics, and the ever-present threat of harsh weather. Margaret found a quiet corner near the refreshment table, positioning herself so that her scarred side faced the wall. She watched Catherine dance with Robert Mitchell, then with 3 other young men, her laughter bright and uncomplicated. "You're Thomas Hayes's other daughter, aren't you?" Margaret turned to find an older woman standing beside her, someone she didn't recognize. The woman was perhaps 60, well-dressed but not ostentatious, with keen grey eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Yes, ma'am. Margaret Hayes. I'm Dorothy Hartwell. I own a ranch in the Paradise Valley, about 20 miles north of here." She paused, studying Margaret's face with a directness that was somehow not unkind. "You do your family's bookkeeping, don't you?" Margaret was surprised. How did you know?" "I make it my business to know things. I also know your father's in debt up to his eyeballs. Your sister's likely to marry rich and leave, and you're the one keeping that farm running." Dorothy smiled slightly. "Don't look so shocked. I've been managing my own ranch for 30 years, since my husband died. I recognize competence when I see it. Thank you. I'm not flattering you, girl. I'm stating facts." Dorothy glanced around the barn, her expression thoughtful. "Tell me, do you know my nephew, Samuel?" "I don't believe so. He owns the ranch adjacent to mine. Lost his sight in an accident 4 years ago. Horse kicked him in the head. Doctors said he'd never work again, but Samuel's stubborn as they come. He still runs his operation, just adapted his methods." Dorothy turned back to Margaret. "He's looking for a wife." Margaret's stomach tightened. "Mrs. Hartwell, I appreciate your kindness, but I'm not interested in pity proposals." "Pity." Dorothy's laugh was sharp. "Child, Samuel doesn't know what you look like, and he wouldn't care if he did. What he needs is someone capable, someone who can manage a household and understand ranch operations. Someone who won't treat him like an invalid or try to take over his life." Her eyes bored into Margaret's. "I think you might be that person. My father would never agree to such a match. There's no advantage in it for him. Your father's about to lose his farm. If Catherine marries Mitchell, she'll be taken care of. But what about you? What happens when the bank comes calling and there's nothing left?" Dorothy's voice softened slightly. "Samuel's ranch is profitable. He's a good man, honest and fair. He'd treat you with respect, more than you're getting now, I'd wager." Margaret wanted to dismiss the offer, to laugh at the absurdity of a blind man choosing a scarred woman out of mutual desperation. But something in Dorothy's words resonated. Respect. When was the last time anyone had offered her that? "Why are you doing this?" Margaret asked quietly. "Because I'm tired of watching capable women wasted," Dorothy said bluntly. "And because my nephew deserves better than the simpering fools who've been throwing themselves at his property. He needs a partner, not a nurse or a gold digger." Before Margaret could respond, her father appeared, his face flushed from whiskey and social exertion. "Margaret, what are you doing bothering Mrs. Hartwell?" "Go wait by the wagon." "She wasn't bothering me, Thomas," Dorothy said coolly. "In fact, we were having quite an interesting conversation about your farm's finances." Thomas's expression went from annoyed to alarmed. "I don't know what she's been telling you, but she hasn't told me anything." I have eyes and ears. Dorothy smiled, but there was steel underneath. We should talk sometime about your options. I might have a proposal that benefits everyone involved. She walked away, leaving Thomas staring after her with confusion and barely concealed anger. He turned on Margaret. What did you say to her? Nothing, Father. She approached me. Well, whatever nonsense she was filling your head with, forget it. The last thing we need is you making connections above your station. He grabbed her arm, his grip painful. Come on, we're leaving. Catherine can ride home with the porters. As they walked to the wagon, Margaret glanced back at the barn one last time. Through the open doors, she could see the dancers spinning beneath the lanterns, the whole scene glowing with warmth and life, a world she'd never been invited to join. But Dorothy Hartwell's words echoed in her mind, and for the first time in years, Margaret allowed herself to imagine something different. Not rescue exactly, but perhaps escape. The question was whether a blind rancher's proposal was a doorway to freedom or just another form of prison she wouldn't have to wait long to find. Out 3 days after the Mitchell gathering, Samuel Hartwell arrived at the Hayes farm unannounced. Margaret was in the vegetable garden, pulling up the last of the root crops before the first hard freeze, when she heard the unfamiliar sound of hoofbeats, accompanied by the jingle of bells. She straightened, wiping soil from her hands, and watched as a rider approached on a massive bay horse. The animal wore a collar of small bells around its neck, their tinkling creating an audible map of movement. The man sat tall in the saddle despite his blindness, his posture relaxed but alert. He was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and a strong jawline shadowed with stubble. His eyes, though sightless, were a striking pale blue that seemed to look through rather than at the world. He wore practical ranch clothing, canvas trousers, a worn leather vest, and boots that had seen years of hard use. "Hello," he called out, his voice deep and steady. "This the Hayes property?" Margaret froze, suddenly aware of the dirt under her fingernails, the sweat on her brow, her old work dress stained with soil and vegetable matter. Then she remembered he couldn't see any of it. "Yes, sir. This is the Hayes farm. Name's Samuel Hartwell. I'm here to speak with Thomas Hayes about a business matter." He dismounted with practiced ease, one hand trailing along the horse's flank until his boots touched ground. "Would you mind directing me to the house?" "I can take you there, Mr. Hartwell. It's just across the yard." Margaret set down her basket and approached cautiously. "May I?"
"Should I take your arm?"
"That'd be helpful, thank you." His hand found hers with surprising accuracy, then moved to rest lightly on her elbow. "Lead on." As they crossed the yard, Margaret was acutely conscious of his proximity, the warmth of his hand through her sleeve. "Your aunt spoke to me at the Mitchell gathering," she said quietly. "Did she now?" There was amusement in his voice. "Let me guess. She told you I was looking for a wife and suggested you might be interested." Margaret's cheeks burned. "Something like that. Aunt Dorothy's about as subtle as a stampede." He chuckled softly. "But she's usually right about people. Said you were practical, capable, and wouldn't waste time with foolishness." She was generous in her assessment. Dorothy isn't generous. If she said it, she meant it. They reached the porch steps and Samuel paused. "I should tell you something before we go in. I'm not here because I pity you or because I'm desperate. I'm here because I need a partner who can handle ranch life, and according to my aunt, you're more qualified than any woman in 3 counties. Before Margaret could respond, the front door swung open. Thomas stood there, his expression shifting from confusion to suspicion to something resembling calculation as he took in the well-dressed blind man on his porch. "Mr. Hayes." Samuel extended his hand in the general direction of the doorway. "Samuel Hartwell. I own the Double H Ranch in Paradise Valley. I'm here to discuss a proposition with you." Thomas's handshake was perfunctory. "What kind of proposition?" "The kind best discussed inside, if you don't mind." "It's a matter of some delicacy." Thomas stepped back reluctantly, allowing them entry. Margaret moved to follow, but her father blocked her path. "This is men's business. Go back to your gardening." "Actually," Samuel said from inside the house, "I'd prefer if Miss Hayes stayed. This concerns her directly." The surprise on Thomas's face was almost worth the confusion Margaret felt. Her father hesitated, then jerked his head toward the parlor. "Fine, Eleanor, bring coffee for our guests." The parlor was the nicest room in the house, reserved for a company that never came. Margaret perched on the edge of a straight-back chair, while Samuel settled onto the sofa with the ease of someone comfortable in unfamiliar spaces. Thomas sat opposite him, his posture rigid with poorly concealed curiosity. Eleanor arrived with the coffee service, her eyes widening when she saw Samuel. Margaret could practically read her mother's thoughts. A prosperous-looking man here to see them, requesting Margaret's presence. Hope bloomed on Eleanor's face like a dangerous flower. "Mr. Hayes," Samuel began after accepting a cup of coffee, "I'll get straight to the point. I'm in need of a wife. My aunt speaks highly of your daughter Margaret, and I'd like your permission to court her with the intention of marriage." The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Thomas stared at Samuel as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. "You want to court Margaret?" Thomas finally said, each word laden with disbelief. "That's correct. You do know what she looks like, don't you?" The words came out harsher than perhaps Thomas intended, but Margaret felt their sting nonetheless. "I'm blind. Mr. Hayes, I don't know what anyone looks like." Samuel's voice remained even, but something in his tone sharpened. "What I do know is that your daughter manages your farm's bookkeeping, handles preservation and storage that requires precision and planning, and according to my aunt, works harder than any two ranch hands." "Those are qualities I value." Thomas leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "What's your ranch worth?" "Direct question." "I appreciate that." Samuel set down his coffee cup with careful precision. "The Double H spans 2,000 acres of prime grazing land. I run 500 head of cattle, have a main house, 2 barns, and a bunkhouse for my hands. My annual income last year was just over $8,000. Margaret saw her father's expression transform. $8,000 was more than most ranchers in the territory made in 3 years. "That's quite an operation for a man who can't see," Thomas said, his tone shifting to something resembling respect. "I have good people working for me, and I've adapted my methods. The ranch runs smoothly." Samuel turned his head toward where Margaret sat, though his sightless eyes couldn't quite meet hers. "But I need a wife who can be a true partner, someone who understands ranch operations, who won't fall apart during calving season or when supplies run low in winter. Someone I can trust with the household management while I handle the outdoor work. And you think Margaret fits that description?" Thomas asked skeptically. "Dorothy does, and I trust her judgment. That's why I'm asking for the opportunity to court your daughter properly, to see if we suit each other before making any final commitments." Thomas stroked his beard, the gears of calculation visible behind his eyes. "What kind of dowry would you expect?" "None." The word hung in the air like a gunshot. "None," Thomas repeated. "I don't need your money, Mr. Hayes. I need a capable wife. If Margaret agrees to marry me, I'll provide well for her." "She'll want for nothing." Samuel paused. "I will, however, require one thing. If we marry, Margaret's welfare becomes my sole concern. Whatever arrangements you have now regarding her labor or her future, those end." Margaret's heart hammered in her chest. No one had ever spoken of her welfare as if it mattered before. Thomas's face darkened. "She's my daughter. I have a right." "You have the right to approve or deny my suit," Samuel interrupted, his voice still calm, but carrying unmistakable steel. "But if you approve, and if she accepts, then she becomes my responsibility. Those are my terms." The room fell silent again. Margaret could see her father warring with himself, his desire to be rid of her fighting against his habit of control and his instinct to squeeze every advantage from any situation. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "Thomas, this is a generous offer." "I know what it is," Thomas snapped. Then more carefully, "Mr. Hartwell, I appreciate your interest, but Margaret has never been courted before. She's inexperienced in such matters. I'd hate for there to be any misunderstandings, which is why I'm proposing a proper courtship," Samuel said. "I'll visit regularly over the next month. We'll talk, get to know each other." If at the end of that time we both feel it's a good match, we'll marry. If not, we'll part ways with no hard feelings. Thomas looked at Margaret for the first time since the conversation began. What do you think about all this? It was a trap, she realized. If she showed too much enthusiasm, he'd find a way to use it against her. If she showed reluctance, he'd accuse her of being ungrateful. I think it's an unusual arrangement, Margaret said carefully. But I'm willing to consider it unusual. Thomas's laugh was bitter. That's one word for it. He stood abruptly. Fine, you have my permission to court her. Mr. Hartwell, but understand this. If you're playing some kind of cruel joke, if you're doing this out of pity or charity, I'll make sure everyone from here to Helena knows about it. Samuel rose as well, his movements precise despite his blindness. I don't do pity, Mr. Hayes, and I don't have time for jokes. He turned toward Margaret. Miss Hayes, would you be willing to show me around your property? I'd like to hear about your operation here. Margaret stood, her legs unsteady. Of course, Mr. Hartwell. Outside, away from her parents' ears, the autumn air felt impossibly fresh. Samuel's hand found her elbow again, and they walked slowly toward the barn. That went better than I expected, Samuel said. Did it? My father practically called me unmarriageable to your face. He's afraid of losing his unpaid laborer. Samuel's observation was matter of fact, without judgment. Dorothy warned me he might be difficult. Your aunt seems to have warned you about a lot of things. She believes in being prepared. They reached the barn, and Samuel paused at the entrance. His head tilted as he listened to the sounds within. Horses shifting in their stalls, chickens clucking in their coop. Tell me about your daily work here. Margaret hesitated, then began describing the farm's operations, her responsibilities, the challenges they faced. As she talked, Samuel asked sharp, insightful questions that revealed his deep understanding of agricultural life. He wanted to know about crop rotation, water sources, animal health, storage methods, details that most men would consider beneath their notice. You've been managing this place almost single-handedly, haven't you? Samuel said after she'd finished describing the harvest process. My father oversees the larger decisions. That's not what I asked. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Yes, I manage most of it. And you've never received credit for that work. No. Samuel was silent for a long while, his face thoughtful. I want to be honest with you, Margaret. May I call you Margaret? Yes, I need a wife for practical reasons. My aunt and the neighboring ranchers have been pestering me about it for years, bringing around their daughters and nieces like I'm some prize bull at auction. His voice held a trace of bitterness. They see a blind man with a successful ranch and think I need rescuing. What I actually need is someone who won't try to take over my life or treat me like I'm helpless, and you think I'm that person. Dorothy thinks so. She's convinced you're competent, independent, and won't waste time with romantic nonsense. He turned to face her, his sightless eyes earnest. I can offer you a comfortable life, Margaret. A home of your own, respect, fair treatment. I won't pretend to offer love. I barely know you. But I can offer partnership and honesty. Margaret studied his face. This stranger who was offering her an escape she'd never dared imagine. Why does your aunt care so much about helping me? Samuel smiled slightly. Because Dorothy was like you once, capable and overlooked. She had to fight for every ounce of respect she got, and she's never forgotten what that feels like. His expression sobered. She also believes we might actually suit each other. Not in the romantic sense, but in the ways that matter for building a life together. You're very honest about your limitations. What's the point in lying? If we marry, you'll discover the truth soon enough. He paused. I should be honest about something else. Being married to a blind man won't be easy. There are things I can't do, things you'll have to handle. I can't read letters, can't review contracts visually, can't see when something's about to go wrong. You'd have to be my eyes in many situations. But you manage your ranch successfully. I do. But I've had years to develop systems, to train my people, to learn the layout of every building and fence line. Bringing a wife into that, it'll require adjustment on both our parts. He tilted his head. The question is whether you're willing to try. Margaret thought about her father's daily cruelty, her mother's worn acceptance, the endless years stretching ahead with nothing to look forward to but more of the same. What would the courtship entail? I'll visit 3 times a week for the next month. We'll talk, work together, see how we get along. At the end of that time, we'll both decide if we want to proceed with marriage. Samuel's expression was open, without guile. I won't pressure you, and I won't hold it against you if you decide I'm not what you want. Fair? Fair, Margaret agreed, though her voice trembled slightly. They walked back to the house in companionable silence. Thomas was waiting on the porch, his arms crossed over his chest. We're agreed, Samuel announced. I'll return on Monday to begin the courtship properly. Margaret, thank you for your time today. Mr. Hartwell, Thomas called as Samuel moved toward his horse. How do you plan to get home? It's 20 miles to Paradise Valley. The same way I got here, carefully. Samuel mounted his horse with fluid grace, gathering the reins. The bells on the animal's collar jingled softly. These bells help me track Bear's movements, and he knows the way home better than I do. We'll be fine. Margaret watched him ride away, the sound of bells fading into the distance. She felt her father's presence behind her, his judgment a physical weight. Well, Thomas said finally, I suppose beggars can't be choosers. A blind husband for a scarred wife seems fitting. His words should have stung, but Margaret found they'd lost their power. For the first time in her life, someone had looked past her scars, or rather, hadn't looked at them at all, and seen something worth valuing. That evening, as she prepared supper, Catherine cornered her in the kitchen. Is it true? Samuel Hartwell wants to court you? Yes, but he's blind. I'm aware. Catherine's pretty face scrunched in confusion. Aren't you scared? He can't even see where he's going. How can he take care of a wife? He seems to manage well enough. He owns a successful ranch. Still, it's strange. Why would he want... Catherine trailed off, realizing what she was about to say. Why would he want someone like me? Margaret finished. Perhaps because he values capability over appearance. A novel concept, I realize, Catherine flushed. That's not what I meant, wasn't it? Margaret turned back to her cooking, suddenly exhausted. It's all right, Catherine. We both know what I am. At least Samuel doesn't have to look at my face every day and be reminded of it. That's a terrible reason to marry someone. Is it worse than marrying for money? Or status? Or because society expects it? Margaret stirred the pot more vigorously than necessary. At least Samuel and I are honest about what we're offering each other. That night, alone in her narrow bed, Margaret allowed herself to imagine life at the Double H Ranch. A home of her own. Work that was acknowledged and valued. A husband who wouldn't flinch when he touched her face, because he'd never see the scars that marked it. It wasn't the romantic dream other girls harbored, but it was something better. It was possible, and for Margaret Hayes, possibility had always been in shorter supply than dreams. Samuel returned on Monday, as promised, arriving in mid-morning with a leather satchel tied to his saddle. Thomas grudgingly allowed Margaret an hour away from her chores, though he made sure to mention all the work that would pile up in her absence. I brought something, Samuel said, once they were alone by the creek that bordered the property. He reached into the satchel and pulled out a book. Dorothy said you like to read. This is one of my favorites from before the accident. I thought maybe you could read it to me and we could discuss it. Margaret took the book reverently. Walden by Henry David Thoreau. You want me to read to you? If you don't mind, I miss books. My foreman sometimes reads ranch correspondence to me, but he's not much for literature. Samuel settled himself on a flat rock near the water. Besides, it'll give us something to talk about besides cattle and weather. So Margaret read, her voice growing stronger as she moved through Thoreau's observations about simple living and self-reliance. Samuel listened with complete attention, occasionally asking her to reread a passage or offering his own interpretation of a particularly dense section. The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation, Margaret read, then paused. Do you think that's true? I think desperation comes in many forms, Samuel said thoughtfully. Sometimes it's loud and obvious. Sometimes it's silent and invisible. He turned his face toward her. What does desperate look like to you? The question was more personal than she'd expected. Margaret thought about her father's constant anxiety about money, her mother's resigned exhaustion, her own feeling of being trapped in a life with no exit. "It looks like having no choices," she said finally. "Then we're both desperate in our own ways. I'm desperate for independence so that people don't want to grant a blind man. You're desperate for—" He trailed off. "What are you desperate for, Margaret?" "To be seen as more than my scars. To have my work matter. To be treated like a person instead of a problem to be solved." The honesty surprised her. But Samuel's presence invited it somehow. "Those seem like reasonable wants. They're apparently too much to ask from my own family." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "If we marry, I'll never see your scars. But I need you to understand. I also won't see your smile, or how you arrange your hair, or the way your eyes look when you laugh. I'll miss all of that. Is that something you can accept?" Margaret had never considered it from that angle. "I suppose we'd both be giving up certain things." "We would. But we'd be gaining others. Partnership, respect, freedom from other people's expectations." He stood, brushing off his trousers. "That's what I'm offering, Margaret. It's not romance, but it might be something better. It might be real." As the days passed, Samuel's visits became the axis around which Margaret's world turned. He came faithfully 3 times each week, and they spent their hours together talking, working, discovering each other's thoughts and habits. Samuel taught her about his ranch operations, describing the layout of buildings and pastures with such precision that Margaret could picture them clearly. She read to him from books and newspapers, discussed farm management strategies, and found herself laughing more than she had in years. Her father watched these courtship sessions with barely concealed resentment, as if Samuel's attention was somehow an accusation against him. Catherine was openly bewildered, unable to comprehend how her scarred older sister had attracted a prosperous rancher when she herself had to work so hard for male attention. But Eleanor showed a different reaction. One evening, as Margaret helped with mending, her mother said quietly, "He's a good man, isn't he?" "I believe so. You seem lighter when he's been here, less burdened." Eleanor's needle paused. "I should have protected you better from your father's words. I should have done many things differently." Margaret looked up, surprised by the admission. "Mother, don't. I know what I've been, weak, complicit, afraid." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly. "But I'm glad you'll have a chance at something better. Samuel sees you the way I should have all along, as someone valuable, someone worthy of respect." The words were both a gift and an indictment, and Margaret didn't know how to respond to either. The month of courtship was drawing to a close, and Margaret knew a decision was coming. Samuel had never pressured her, never pushed for an answer before she was ready. But time was running out, and soon she would have to choose the familiar misery of her current life or the uncertain promise of something new. The question wasn't whether she would say yes. It was whether she had the courage to claim the life she wanted, even if it came in an unexpected package. On the final day of their agreed courtship period, Samuel arrived with a small box in his pocket. It was time to decide. The box felt heavier than its size suggested. Samuel held it carefully in his palm, his thumb tracing the worn leather edges as he stood beside Margaret near the creek. November had arrived with its first dusting of snow, transforming the Montana landscape into something stark and beautiful. "Before I ask you anything," Samuel began, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air, "I want you to understand what you'd be agreeing to. Not the romanticized version, but the truth." Margaret pulled her shawl tighter against the wind. "I'm listening. The Double H Ranch is my entire world. I've rebuilt my life around it after the accident, created systems that let me work despite my blindness. But it's demanding work, Margaret. We're up before dawn every day. Calving season means sleepless nights. Winter storms can trap us for weeks. The isolation can be crushing. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away." He paused, his sightless eyes fixed somewhere past her shoulder. "My hands respect me, but some of them will question you at first. They'll wonder if you're capable, If you're just another city woman playing at ranch life, you'll have to prove yourself. I've been proving myself my entire life, not like this. This will be different, harder in some ways, easier in others. Samuel shifted his weight, and Margaret noticed how precisely he'd memorized the terrain, never stumbling despite his lack of vision. I also need to be clear about expectations. I won't demand affection you don't feel. Our bedroom arrangement will be whatever you're comfortable with. But I will expect honesty, loyalty, and genuine partnership. Can you give me those things? Margaret considered the question seriously. Her entire life had been defined by what others expected of her, what they thought she should be grateful for, what limitations they imposed on her existence. Samuel was offering something radical, a relationship built on mutual need and respect rather than obligation or pity. Yes, she said, I can give you those things, but I have conditions too. Samuel's eyebrows rose slightly. Go on. I won't be treated like a possession. I've watched my father control every aspect of my mother's life, and I won't accept that. Margaret's voice was steady. If I'm to be your partner, then I need you to trust my judgment. When I make decisions about the household, about finances, about ranch matters, you need to believe I'm acting in our best interest. Agreed. And I want to learn everything. Not just cooking and cleaning, I want to understand the entire operation. How you manage the cattle, how you've adapted your work methods, how you negotiate with buyers, everything. A slow smile spread across Samuel's face. Dorothy said you were ambitious. I'm starting to think she undersold you. Is that a problem? Not even slightly. An ambitious wife is exactly what I need. He held out the box. This was my mother's wedding ring. It's simple, nothing fancy, just a gold band with a small diamond. I can't see it to know if it's fashionable, but Dorothy assures me it's appropriate. He opened the box with careful fingers. Margaret Hayes, will you marry me? Not out of desperation or convenience, but as a genuine partner who shares my life and my work. Margaret took the ring from the box, studying it in the weak winter sunlight. The band was indeed simple, worn smooth by years of wear. The diamond was modest, but well cut, catching light with quiet elegance. It was nothing like the elaborate rings she'd seen on Catherine's suitors' offerings, but it was real, solid and unpretentious. Like the man offering it, yes, she said, and was surprised by how certain she sounded. Yes, I'll marry you. Samuel's smile transformed his entire face, revealing a warmth and joy she hadn't seen before. May I? He held out his hand and Margaret placed hers in it. His fingers found the ring by touch, then slid it carefully onto her finger. It fit perfectly. How did you know the size? I didn't. I guessed based on when you held my arm, how your hand felt. Apparently I guessed right. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, a gesture so unexpected and courtly that Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you for taking a chance on me. Thank you for seeing past what everyone else sees. I don't see past anything, Margaret. I just see different things. His thumb brushed over her knuckles. Now comes the hard part, telling your father we're done courting and ready to marry. Thomas Hayes received the news with a complicated expression that cycled through surprise, calculation and finally grudging approval. How soon? 2 weeks, Samuel said firmly. That gives Margaret time to prepare and gives me time to get the house ready for her arrival. 2 weeks? That's barely enough time. It's plenty of time for what we need, Samuel interrupted. A simple ceremony at the church, witnessed by family. Nothing elaborate. Thomas's eyes narrowed. You trying to rush this before you change your mind? I'm trying to get married before winter sets in completely, Samuel replied evenly. The mountain passes can become impassable, and I have family coming from the eastern part of the territory. 2 weeks, Mr. Hayes. That's what we've decided. The word decided hung in the air, not what I've decided, but what we've decided. It was a subtle assertion of Margaret's autonomy, and from the tightening of Thomas's jaw he caught it. Fine, 2 weeks. But you'll cover all the expenses. I won't be gouged by merchants for a rushed wedding. Already planned on it. Samuel stood, and Margaret rose with him. Margaret and I will need some time this week to make arrangements. I trust you can spare her from farm work? It wasn't really a question, and Thomas knew it. She can have the mornings. The farm still needs running. As they left the house, Margaret felt the weight of the ring on her finger, both literal and metaphorical. She was engaged. In 2 weeks she would be married. The reality of it was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. "You're very good at managing my father," she observed as they walked toward Samuel's horse. "I've dealt with difficult men before. The trick is being firm without being aggressive. They respect strength but react badly to challenge." He paused. "Though I suspect you already knew that. You've been managing him for years, just in different ways." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Dorothy Hartwell descended upon the Hayes farm like a benevolent whirlwind, bringing fabric for a wedding dress, organizing the ceremony details, and running interference with Thomas whenever he attempted to inject his own opinions into the proceedings. "This is Margaret's wedding, not yours," Dorothy informed him when he complained about the modest guest list. "If you want a grand social event, wait for Catherine's turn." Margaret found herself grateful for Dorothy's presence. The older woman had a way of cutting through social niceties to get things done, and her affection for Samuel made her protective of Margaret by extension. "He's a good boy," Dorothy said one afternoon as she helped Margaret pack her belongings. "Stubborn as granite and twice as dense about his own needs, but good-hearted. He'll treat you well. Why didn't he marry before the accident?" Margaret asked. "He would have had plenty of opportunities." "He was engaged once, actually. A girl named Victoria Brennan, daughter of a railroad executive. A pretty little thing, all curls and laughter." Dorothy's expression soured. "The accident happened 3 months before the wedding. Victoria lasted about 2 weeks before she broke the engagement. Said she couldn't be married to a man who couldn't even look at her properly." Margaret felt anger rise in her chest. "That's cruel. That's people. They want the package they signed up for, not the reality that comes with living." Dorothy folded one of Margaret's dresses with brisk efficiency. "Samuel pretended it didn't hurt, but I know better. He threw himself into rebuilding the ranch, proving he could still be useful. Worked himself nearly to death that first year. And now he's marrying a woman with a scarred face. People will say he's settled. People say lots of things. Most of it's nonsense." Dorothy fixed Margaret with a sharp look. "You're worried about what this marriage looks like from the outside. Stop. What matters is what it is on the inside. And from what I've seen, you two might actually build something real together." The wedding took place on a grey November morning, with snow falling in lazy spirals outside the small church. Margaret wore a simple dress of deep green wool that Dorothy had somehow procured, along with her mother's veil, the only heirloom Eleanor insisted on sharing. The ceremony was brief. Reverend Walsh spoke about partnership and commitment, carefully avoiding any flowery language about love or beauty that might ring hollow given the circumstances. Samuel recited his vows in a clear, steady voice, his hand warm around Margaret's. When it was her turn, Margaret found her own voice surprisingly strong. "I promise to be your partner in all things, to honor your trust, and to build a life with you based on honesty and respect." Simple words, but she meant everyone. The kiss that sealed their marriage was chaste, a brief press of lips that nonetheless sent a shiver through Margaret. Samuel's hand cupped her scarred cheek gently, his thumb brushing the ridged tissue as if it was silk. It was the first time anyone had touched her scars with tenderness rather than pity or revulsion. The wedding breakfast at the Hayes farm was a tense affair. Catherine kept staring at Margaret as if her sister had transformed into a stranger. Thomas drank too much and made increasingly awkward toasts about unlikely matches and making the best of things. Eleanor cried quietly into her handkerchief. Dorothy finally stood, her glass raised. To Margaret and Samuel, two practical people building a practical life. May they find more joy in it than the romantics ever do. It was perhaps the most honest toast anyone could have offered, and Margaret appreciated it more than flowery sentiments. By mid-afternoon, Margaret's belongings were loaded onto a wagon driven by Samuel's foreman, a weathered man named Jack Wheeler, who'd been with the Double H for 15 years. Samuel helped Margaret onto his horse, settling behind her in the saddle, his arms coming around her to hold the reins. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Margaret looked back at the farm that had been her prison for 23 years. Her father stood on the porch, his expression unreadable. Catherine waved half-heartedly. Eleanor clutched her shawl and looked like she might cry again. "Yes," Margaret said. "I'm ready." The ride to Paradise Valley took 3 hours, following mountain roads that climbed steadily upward. Samuel maintained a commentary as they rode, describing the landscape from memory, where the creek forked, which meadow produced the best wildflowers in spring, how the aspens turned gold in autumn. Jack's wagon rumbled behind them, and gradually Margaret felt the tension in her shoulders ease. "You're quiet," Samuel observed. "I'm thinking." About? About how strange it is that this morning I was Margaret Hayes, living the same life I'd lived for years, and now I'm Margaret Hartwell, riding toward a completely different existence. She leaned back slightly against his chest. "It doesn't feel real yet. Give it time. Reality has a way of asserting itself, usually around 3 in the morning during calving season." There was humor in his voice. "Though I should warn you, the house isn't fancy. It's functional and comfortable, but don't expect anything like the Mitchell place. I don't need fancy. I need something real. Then you'll like it." The Double H Ranch revealed itself gradually as they crested a final ridge. The main house was a sprawling single-story structure built of logs and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. 2 large barns stood nearby, along with a bunkhouse and several smaller outbuildings. Fences divided the visible land into neat pastures, where cattle grazed despite the cold. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and Margaret could see ranch hands moving about their afternoon duties. "Tell me what you see," Samuel said softly. So Margaret described it, the layout of the buildings, the condition of the fences, the cattle, the mountains, rising dramatically in the background. Samuel listened intently, occasionally asking questions, building a mental picture from her words. As they approached the main house, a woman emerged onto the porch. She was perhaps 50, with iron-grey hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the sturdy build of someone who'd spent her life in physical labor. "That's Ruth Calloway," Samuel explained. "She's been my housekeeper since before the accident. Runs the household like a military operation. You'll either love her or find her terrifying. Most people experience both." Ruth came down the steps as Samuel dismounted, then helped Margaret down with surprising gentleness. "So this is the new Mrs. Hartwell. Ruth, this is Margaret." Samuel's hand found Margaret's elbow. "Margaret, Ruth keeps this place running. Anything you need to know about the house, she's your resource." Ruth studied Margaret with shrewd eyes that missed nothing. Not the scars, not the worn traveling dress, not the nervous way Margaret clutched her small traveling bag. "You look half frozen. Come inside. I've got stew on and fresh bread. Mr. Hartwell, your aunt sent word ahead. I've prepared the main bedroom." The inside of the house was warm and surprisingly well organized. The main room featured a massive stone fireplace, comfortable furniture arranged with clear pathways between them, and windows that would provide excellent light during the day. Everything was placed with obvious intentionality. No clutter, no obstacles. Nothing that would confuse a blind man moving through his own home. Each room has a specific layout, Samuel explained as he guided Margaret through the house. "I've memorized it all. Ruth and the hands know never to move furniture or leave things where they don't belong. It seems rigid, but it's necessary for me to function independently." He showed her the kitchen, where Ruth presided over a cast-iron stove large enough to cook for a dozen people. The dining room with its long table is scarred by years of use. A study lined with books Samuel could no longer read. And finally, the bedroom. It was spacious and simply furnished. A large bed with a wedding ring quilt, a wardrobe, a dresser with a mirror, 2 comfortable chairs near the window. Someone had started a fire in the small fireplace, and the room was pleasantly warm. "Ruth prepared this for us," Samuel said, and Margaret heard the slight tension in his voice. "But I meant what I said about our arrangement. It's fine," Margaret interrupted. "It's a lovely room. What she didn't say was that it was the nicest room she'd ever had. Growing up, she'd shared a tiny space with Catherine, then moved to an even smaller room when her sister demanded more privacy. This room, with its warmth and privacy and space, felt like luxury. Samuel seemed to sense her thoughts. "It's yours now. Truly yours. Do with it what you like." That evening, Margaret met the ranch hands at supper. There were 6 of them, Jack Wheeler, whom she'd met already, 2 younger men named Tom and Danny, who couldn't be more than 20, an older cowboy called Salty Pete, who'd apparently earned his nickname from his language, a quiet indigenous man named Joseph, who managed the horses, and a teenage boy named Billy, who handled odd jobs and was learning the trade. They were polite but reserved, clearly waiting to see what kind of woman their boss had married. Ruth served stew and bread with ruthless efficiency, and conversation was minimal until Salty Pete finally broke the ice. "So, Mrs. Hartwell, you ever worked cattle?" "No, but I've managed a farm for several years. I understand hard work and long hours. Farm work ain't ranch work," Danny said not unkindly. "Cattle are unpredictable. They'll kick charge, go where they shouldn't. Takes a special kind of stubbornness to handle them." Margaret smiled slightly. "I've been handling a stubborn father for 23 years. I imagine I can learn to handle stubborn cattle." That got a few chuckles. Tom leaned forward. "Boss says you're good with numbers. That true?" "I managed our farm's bookkeeping and finances, yes." "Well, that's useful. Boss can handle the ranch operations, but the paperwork's been piling up. None of us can read or cipher well enough to help him with contracts and such." Samuel had been quiet, letting his men assess Margaret on their own terms. Now he spoke up. "Margaret will be handling all administrative tasks, correspondence, accounts, contracts. She'll also be learning the ranch operations so she can serve as my eyes when needed. I expect you all to treat her with respect and answer her questions honestly." It was a clear statement of authority, and the men nodded their acceptance. Margaret felt a flutter of anxiety mixed with determination. These men would judge her on her competence, not her appearance. It was both liberating and daunting. After supper, Samuel showed Margaret his study, where stacks of papers covered every surface. "This is the part I struggle with most. Ruth reads me the important correspondence, but she's not trained in business matters. I need someone who can not only read, but understand what they're reading, who can advise me on decisions." Margaret surveyed the chaos with a practiced eye. "This will take time to organize, but it's manageable. Do you have a system for filing?" "I did before the accident. Now it's more of a controlled disaster." Samuel sounded rueful. "I know where most things are by touch and memory, but it's inefficient. We'll create a new system, one that works for both of us." Margaret picked up a contract from the nearest pile. "May I read this to you?" They spent the next 2 hours going through paperwork, with Margaret reading and Samuel explaining context, making decisions, dictating responses. It was work, but it was also something more, a glimpse of the partnership they were building, where her skills complemented his experience. When they finally retired to their bedroom, the awkwardness Margaret had been dreading materialized. She changed into her nightgown behind the dressing screen, while Samuel sat in one of the chairs, his back to her to preserve her modesty, despite his inability to see. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I know this is strange. We barely know each other, and now we're expected to share a bedroom. But there's no rush for anything beyond sleep. We have time to figure this out." Margaret emerged from behind the screen, grateful for his understanding, even as she wondered what he expected. "Thank you for being patient." "I'm not being patient. I'm being practical." He stood, moving to the other side of the bed with careful steps. "We both need rest. Tomorrow starts early. Ruth will have you up before dawn. The ranch doesn't care that you just got married." They lay in the darkness on opposite sides of the large bed, a careful distance between them. Margaret stared at the ceiling, listening to Samuel's breathing gradually even out into sleep. Her mind raced with everything that had happened, everything that was coming. She was married. She was a rancher's wife. She had responsibilities, opportunities, a future that was hers to shape. For the first time in her life, Margaret Hartwell felt the stirring of something dangerous and exhilarating. Hope. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But tonight, in this warm room, in this solid house, she let herself believe that she'd made the right choice. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the Double H ranch in white. Inside, two strangers who'd become partners slept peacefully, unaware of the trials and triumphs that lay ahead. Their real story was just beginning. Margaret's first full day as mistress of the Double H ranch began at 4:30. In the morning, when Ruth knocked sharply on the bedroom door, "Mrs. Hartwell, daylight's coming. Breakfast needs preparing, and the men will be hungry." Samuel was already awake, dressing with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to navigate by touch and memory. "Ruth's punctual to a fault," he said with a hint of amusement. "You'll get used to the hours, eventually." Margaret dragged herself from the warm cocoon of quilts, her body protesting the early hour. In her father's house, she'd risen early, but never quite this early. She dressed quickly in one of her work dresses, braided her hair, and followed Samuel to the kitchen. Ruth was already there, flour dusting her apron as she worked biscuit dough with vigorous hands. "There's coffee on the stove. Help yourself, then I'll show you where everything's kept." The men expect breakfast by 5:30. Biscuits, eggs, bacon, gravy. Lunch is at noon sharp, dinner at 6. No variations, no delays. Ranch runs on schedule. It wasn't a request, but a statement of fact. Margaret poured herself coffee from the massive pot on the stove and began learning Ruth's kingdom. The kitchen was impressively organized. Every item had its place, clearly labeled with Ruth's neat handwriting. Dry goods in the pantry, organized by type. Preserves in the cellar, dated and categorized. Cooking implements hung on specific hooks, always returned to the same spot. "Mr. Hartwell needs consistency," Ruth explained as she demonstrated how to make gravy. "Can't have things moved around, or he'll hurt himself stumbling over them. This system works. Don't change it without asking first." The warning was clear. This was Ruth's domain, and Margaret was a guest until she proved herself worthy of partnership. Breakfast service was an orchestrated chaos. The ranch hands filed in precisely at 5:30, taking their assigned seats at the long table. Ruth and Margaret served platter after platter: biscuits, scrambled eggs, thick-cut bacon, sausage gravy, fried potatoes. The men ate with single-minded focus, occasionally grunting approval, but mostly concentrating on consuming enough fuel for the hard day ahead. Samuel sat at the head of the table, eating efficiently while Jack reviewed the day's work assignments. 3 men would ride out to check the fence lines in the northern pasture. 2 would work on repairing the barn roof before the next snowfall. Billy would muck out stalls and tend to basic maintenance. "Mrs. Hartwell," Jack said, wiping his mouth with his napkin, "Boss mentioned you'd be learning ranch operations. You want to ride out with us today? See how we work the herd?" Margaret glanced at Samuel, who nodded encouragingly. "That would be valuable. Margaret needs to understand what we're doing and why." "I'd appreciate that, Mr. Wheeler," Margaret said. "Though I should warn you, I'm not an experienced rider. We'll get you mounted on Daisy. She's calm enough for a beginner, and she knows the property better than most of us." Jack stood, stretching. "Meet at the stable in half an hour. Dress warm. It's going to be cold out there." After the men departed, Margaret helped Ruth clean up the breakfast dishes. The older woman worked in silence for several minutes before speaking. "You held up well this morning. Some new wives can't handle the early hours or the rough crowd. I'm used to hard work. Work's one thing. This life is another." Ruth scrubbed a pan with particular vigor. "Mr. Hartwell's a good man, but he's set in his ways. Had to be after losing his sight. He built this place back up from near ruin, proved everyone wrong who said a blind man couldn't run a ranch. But that kind of fighting makes a person rigid, difficult to live with sometimes." Margaret heard the unspoken warning. Samuel's independence came at a price. "I don't expect this to be easy, Mrs. Calloway." "Ruth, if we're working together, might as well use first names." The housekeeper finally looked directly at Margaret, her gaze assessing. "Your face doesn't bother me, if you're wondering. I've seen plenty worse. But it'll bother some folks in town when you go for supplies. Just prepare yourself for stares and whispers. I've had 23 years of practice. Ranch wife gets different attention than farm daughter. People will judge Mr. Hartwell's choice, make assumptions about why he married you. Best to develop a thick skin now. Margaret appreciated Ruth's bluntness. Thank you for the honesty. Honesty's all I know how to give. Ruth hung up her dishcloth with precise movements. Now go get ready for your ride. And Margaret, don't let the men intimidate you. They're testing you, seeing what you're made of. Show them you can handle ranch life and they'll accept you. Show weakness and they'll lose respect for both you and Mr. Hartwell. The weight of expectation settled on Margaret's shoulders as she changed into her warmest clothing. This wasn't just about learning ranch operations. It was about proving she belonged here. That Samuel's choice to marry her had been sound judgment rather than desperation or pity. At the stable, Joseph had already saddled a gentle-looking mare with a graying muzzle and kind eyes. "This is Daisy," he said in his quiet way. "She's 20 years old, seen everything twice. You could fall asleep in the saddle, and she'd still bring you home safe." Tom and Danny were already mounted on livelier horses, clearly amused at the prospect of teaching the boss's new wife about ranch work. Jack sat astride a massive roan gelding that looked like it could pull a plow single-handedly. "Ever been on a horse, Mrs. Hartwell?" Tom asked. "A few times. Mostly wagon driving." "Well, Daisy'll take care of you. Just sit deep in the saddle, keep your heels down, and let her follow the other horses." Jack adjusted his hat against the morning sun. "We're checking the north fence line today. It's about a 2-hour ride out, then we'll patrol the perimeter looking for breaks or weak spots. Cattle like to test fences, especially the young bulls." The ride out was challenging. November cold bit through Margaret's layers, and her inexperience on horseback became immediately apparent. She bounced awkwardly in the saddle, gripped the reins too tightly, and nearly lost her seat when Daisy stepped over a fallen log. But the old mare was patient, adjusting her pace to accommodate her nervous rider, and gradually Margaret found a rhythm. The landscape was breathtaking in its harsh beauty. Snow-covered mountains rose in every direction, their peaks sharp against the pale blue sky. Pine forests gave way to open meadows where cattle grazed, their breath steaming in the cold air. Margaret understood why Samuel loved this place, why he'd fought so hard to keep working it, despite his blindness. "Boss built most of these fences himself," Danny said as they reached the northern boundary. "After the accident, everyone said he should sell, that he'd never manage the property. But he learned to work by sound and touch, developed systems for everything. It's pretty incredible when you think about it." They dismounted to inspect the fence line. Jack showed Margaret how to check for loose wire, rotted posts, and gaps where animals might push through. It was meticulous work requiring attention to detail, exactly the kind of task Margaret excelled at. "You've got a good eye for this," Tom observed as Margaret pointed out a section where the wire was beginning to separate from the post. Most folks wouldn't notice that until it became a real problem. The compliment warmed her more than she expected. For the next hour, she worked alongside the men, learning how to repair minor damage, when to flag major issues for more extensive work, and how to assess the overall integrity of the fencing system. Her hands grew numb from the cold, and her back ached from unfamiliar labor, but she didn't complain. As they remounted for the return journey, Jack rode up beside her. "You did well today. Better than I expected, if I'm being honest. You thought I'd be useless. Thought you'd be soft. City girls usually are, even farm girls who haven't done ranch work." He glanced at her with something resembling approval. "But you kept up, asked smart questions, and didn't whine about the cold. That matters out here." By the time they returned to the ranch, it was nearly noon. Margaret's entire body screamed with exhaustion, muscles she didn't know she had protesting the morning's exertion. She unsaddled Daisy with Joseph's patient instruction, learning how to properly care for the horse after a ride. "A good horse is worth more than most people," Joseph said as he showed her how to brush Daisy's coat. "Treat them right, they'll save your life someday. Treat them poorly, they'll remember." Margaret filed away the lesson along with everything else she'd learned that morning. Ruth had lunch ready when she entered the house, thick sandwiches, vegetable soup, and apple pie. Samuel was already at the table, and his face brightened when he heard her footsteps. How was the ride? Educational, exhausting, cold. Margaret sank into her chair gratefully. But I learned a lot. Jack said you did well. That's high praise from him. He doesn't give compliments easily. Over lunch, Margaret described what she'd seen and learned. Samuel listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions or adding information about why they managed things certain ways. It reminded her of their courtship conversations, this easy exchange of knowledge and perspective. This afternoon, I thought you could tackle the study, Samuel suggested. Get familiar with our filing system, or lack thereof. We've got a cattle buyer coming next week, and I need to know exactly what our numbers look like. The afternoon was spent in the study, surrounded by paperwork that chronicled years of ranch operations. Margaret created piles, current contracts, past invoices, correspondence requiring response, legal documents, personal records. Ruth brought her tea and sandwiches without being asked, a small gesture that suggested growing acceptance. As Margaret worked, she discovered the true financial picture of the Double H. Samuel had been honest about the ranch's success, but he'd understated it significantly. His operation was one of the most profitable in the territory, with contracts from multiple buyers and a reputation for high-quality cattle. He'd accomplished this, despite his blindness, through sheer determination and intelligent management. She also found the letter from Victoria Brennan, tucked into a drawer. The broken engagement notice was formal and cold, citing changed circumstances and incompatible futures. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of Samuel's suffering, just a legal dissolution of promises made. Margaret understood then why Samuel had approached marriage as a business arrangement. He'd learned the hard way that romantic promises meant nothing when tested by adversity. That evening, after dinner was served and cleaned, Margaret joined Samuel on the porch. He sat in a rocking chair, his face turned toward the sunset he couldn't see, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. I found the letter from Victoria, Margaret said quietly. Samuel was silent for a long moment. Snooping through my desk already? Organizing. There's a difference. She sat in the chair beside his. She was cruel to leave you like that, she was honest. That's more than some people manage. Samuel's voice was carefully neutral. Victoria wanted a husband who could escort her to social events, who could admire her beauty, who could give her the life she'd imagined. I couldn't be that person anymore. So instead, you found someone who doesn't need those things. I found someone who values the same things I do: competence, honesty, partnership. He turned his face toward her. Do you regret it? Marriage. Margaret considered the question seriously. I'm exhausted. I ache in places I didn't know could ache, and Ruth has made it clear I'm on probationary status in the kitchen. But no, I don't regret it. For the first time in my life, I'm being judged on what I can do rather than what I look like. That's worth some sore muscles. Samuel's hand reached out, finding hers on the arm of her chair. His fingers interlaced with hers, warm and calloused. Thank you for being willing to try this life. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell over the ranch. In the distance, cattle lowered softly. Somewhere a coyote called to the emerging stars. The wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying the scent of snow and wood smoke. Margaret thought about her father's house, where she'd spent 23 years being reminded of her inadequacy. She thought about Catherine, beautiful and desired, but ultimately as trapped as Margaret had been, just in a prettier cage. And she thought about this new life, hard and demanding, but offering something precious, the chance to be valued for who she was, rather than condemned for what she wasn't. The next few weeks established a pattern. Margaret rose before dawn, helped Ruth with breakfast, spent mornings learning various aspects of ranch work: riding, roping, cattle management, equipment maintenance. Afternoons were devoted to administrative tasks, organizing the chaos of paperwork into a functional system. Evenings belonged to Samuel, where they'd discuss the day, make plans, and slowly build the foundation of genuine partnership. The ranch hand's initial skepticism gradually transformed into grudging respect. Margaret proved herself capable of hard work, quick to learn and unafraid to get dirty. When a fence broke during a December storm and 3 heifers escaped, she rode out with the men in freezing rain to help round them up. When Billy broke his arm and couldn't do his chores, she took over mucking stalls without complaint. When Jack needed someone to help him with a difficult calving, she held the lantern steady for 3 hours in the middle of the night, never flinching at the blood and mess. But acceptance from the ranch community wasn't the same as acceptance from the wider world. That became clear when Samuel took Margaret to town for the first time. Paradise Valley's main street was a collection of wooden buildings housing essential businesses: general store, blacksmith, saloon, church, doctor's office, and hotel. It was market day, and the street bustled with ranchers and farmers conducting business. Samuel navigated the familiar terrain with Margaret's arm in his, describing locations from memory. General store is 3 buildings down on the left. Mrs. Henderson runs it. She's fair with prices, but likes to gossip. Post office is attached to the back. We'll pick up mail, place our supply order, then stop by the bank. As they walked, Margaret felt eyes following them. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Women clutched their children closer, as if scarred skin might be contagious. Men stared openly, their expressions ranging from pity to disgust to prurient curiosity. "Let them look," Samuel murmured. "Their opinions don't pay our bills." Inside the general store, Mrs. Henderson's friendly greeting froze when she saw Margaret. The shopkeeper's eyes widened, her gaze fixing on the scarred side of Margaret's face with undisguised shock. "Mr. Hartwell! I didn't realize you'd— That is, I heard you'd married, but I didn't—" Mrs. Henderson floundered, unable to complete a coherent sentence. "This is my wife, Margaret," Samuel said pleasantly, either unaware of or choosing to ignore the woman's discomfort. "We need to place a supply order for the month." As Margaret read through their supply list, she felt Mrs. Henderson's stare like a physical weight. Other customers drifted closer, pretending to browse while stealing glances. Whispers followed them through the store. "That's his wife." "The one with the face?" "I heard she was desperate, came from a poor farm. He probably felt sorry for her. Well, at least he can't see what he married." "That's something." The word stung, but Margaret kept her voice steady as she completed the order. She'd endured worse from her own father. She could certainly endure gossip from strangers. At the bank, the manager, a fastidious man named Whitmore, was more polite but no less obviously disturbed by Margaret's appearance. He conducted business with Samuel while barely acknowledging Margaret's presence, as if she were a servant rather than a rancher's wife. "How much do I have in the account?" Samuel asked. Whitmore hesitated. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately, Mr. Hartwell? My wife handles all our financial matters." "Whatever you tell me, you can tell her." The bank manager's lips thinned with disapproval. "Very well. Your current balance is $8,342. Margaret pulled out the ledger she'd brought. "And the outstanding loan on the South property purchase?" Whitmore looked at her as if a dog had spoken. That information is relevant to our financial planning," Margaret finished calmly. "Mr. Hartwell asked me to review all accounts. I'm simply doing my job." Samuel's hand found hers under the table, a brief squeeze of support. "Answer my wife's question, Whitmore." The remainder of the meeting proceeded with Whitmore addressing his responses to the air between them, unable to look directly at either Samuel's blind eyes or Margaret's scarred face. By the time they left, Margaret felt exhausted from the effort of maintaining her composure. "That was unpleasant," Samuel said once they were back on the street. "You noticed. I'm blind, not deaf." I could hear the shock in Mrs. Henderson's voice, the disapproval in Whitmore's tone. He squeezed her arm gently. "I'm sorry. I knew there would be talk, but experiencing it is different. I'm used to it. You shouldn't have to be." They collected their mail from the post office. More stares, more whispers, and began the journey home. The ride back gave Margaret time to process the experience. She'd known intellectually that people would judge their marriage, but experiencing the full weight of that judgment was draining. Back at the ranch, Ruth took one look at Margaret's face and wordlessly poured her a cup of strong tea. Town trip? Yes, they're fools, all of them. Give it time. They'll find something else to gossip about soon enough. But that evening, as Margaret sat at Samuel's desk working through correspondence, she found herself wondering if Ruth was right. Would people eventually accept her, or would she always be that scarred woman the blind rancher married? A letter in the stack caught her attention. Expensive stationery, elegant handwriting. She opened it and began to read, her stomach sinking with each line. It was from Victoria Brennan. Margaret stared at Victoria Brennan's letter, her hands trembling slightly as she read the elegant script. Dear Samuel, I hope this letter finds you well. I've heard through mutual acquaintances that you recently married. Please accept my congratulations, belated though they may be. I'm writing because I'll be passing through Paradise Valley next month on my way to Seattle. My father has business interests in the territory, and I thought it might be an opportunity to call on you. I realize our parting was difficult, but sufficient time has passed that we might meet as old friends. I would very much like to see what you've accomplished with the ranch. Everyone speaks so highly of your success, and I confess to considerable curiosity about how you've managed it all. Please give my regards to your new wife. With warmest wishes, Victoria. The letter was poison wrapped in pleasantries. Margaret recognized the manipulation immediately. The false warmth, the backhanded compliments, the assumption that she'd be welcomed after abandoning Samuel in his darkest hour. Samuel entered the study, his footsteps sure on the familiar floorboards. You're quiet. Something wrong? Margaret handed him the letter. This came in today's mail. From Victoria Brennan. Samuel's expression shifted as Margaret read the letter aloud. By the time she finished, his jaw was tight. She wants to visit. She wants to see what you've built without her. She wants to judge whether she made a mistake. Margaret set the letter down carefully. What do you want to do? Burn it and pretend it never arrived. Samuel moved to his desk chair, sitting heavily. But that would be cowardice, wouldn't it? It would be self-protection. There's a difference. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Part of me wants to show her exactly what she gave up. Prove that her leaving didn't break me, that I built something better without her. His hands clenched on the armrests. But another part knows that inviting her here would be cruel to you. You don't deserve to be displayed like evidence in an argument I'm having with my past. Margaret appreciated his consideration, but something else was stirring in her chest, not jealousy exactly, but a fierce protective instinct. Let her come. Margaret, let her come, Margaret repeated firmly. Let her see what you've built. Let her see that you've found a partner who values you for who you are, not what you can give her. And let her see that I'm not afraid of her. Samuel tilted his head, a small smile playing at his lips. You want to prove something. Maybe I do. Is that so wrong? No, it's actually rather satisfying. Samuel reached out and Margaret placed her hand in his. But we do this together. No games, no pretending to be something we're not. We show her the truth, that this marriage, unconventional as it is, works. The letter was answered with careful courtesy. Victoria was welcome to visit for afternoon tea in 3 weeks' time. Samuel's response was polite but cool, establishing clear boundaries about the nature of the visit. Those 3 weeks passed in a blur of activity. December brought the first serious snowstorm, dumping 2 feet of snow overnight and trapping everyone on the ranch for 5 days. Margaret learned how to manage livestock in extreme weather, hauling feed through waist-deep drifts, breaking ice on water troughs, and checking on cattle who'd sought shelter in the barn. She also learned the intimacy that came from being trapped indoors with her husband. They spent evenings by the fire, Samuel teaching her Braille so she could read to him from his old books. Margaret discovered he had a dry wit that emerged when he was relaxed, and a singing voice he rarely displayed in public. They played chess using a board with raised and indented squares, Margaret calling out her moves so Samuel could track the game mentally. One night, as they prepared for bed, Samuel's fingers traced the scars on Margaret's face with gentle curiosity. "Tell me what they feel like. Not physically, I can feel that. But what do they mean to you?" Margaret had never been asked that question before. "They're a map of the worst day of my life. But they're also proof that I survived. That I'm stronger than the fire that tried to destroy me. I wish I could have known you before the fire. And after. Both versions of you. The before version was unremarkable. A plain girl who would have grown into a plain woman. The fire didn't take beauty from me. It took ordinariness. It made me permanently visible in the worst possible way." Margaret paused. "But it also made me resilient. Made me learn to value things beyond appearance." Samuel's hand moved to cup her undamaged cheek. "Then perhaps we're both products of our tragedies. The accident took my sight, but taught me to see what matters. The kiss that followed was different from their chaste wedding kiss. Deeper, more searching. It was a beginning, tentative but genuine, of something neither had expected. Actual affection growing between them." The day of Victoria's visit arrived with bright sunshine and temperatures cold enough to freeze breath in the air. Ruth had prepared an elaborate tea service, her usual efficiency sharpened by protective instinct. The ranch hands found excuses to work near the house, their loyalty to Samuel evident in their suspicious glances at the approaching carriage. Victoria Brennan was everything Margaret had imagined and worse. She stepped from the carriage in a dove-grey travelling suit that probably cost more than Margaret's entire wardrobe, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed beneath her fashionable hat. She was beautiful in the effortless way of women who'd never known hardship, her skin porcelain smooth, her figure enviably elegant. Her eyes widened when she saw Margaret waiting on the porch, shock flickering across her perfect features before she managed to school them into polite neutrality. "Mrs. Hartwell." Victoria extended a gloved hand. "How lovely to meet you." Margaret shook the offered hand, noting its softness. This woman had never worked a day in her life. "Miss Brennan, Samuel is in the parlor." "Please come in." Samuel stood as they entered, his posture formal. "Victoria, Samuel." Victoria's voice caught slightly. "You look well. Better than I expected. Did you expect me to be broken?" The question was mild, but Margaret heard the steel underneath. "No, of course not. I just meant—" Victoria fumbled, off balance. "The ranch looks prosperous. You've clearly done well for yourself." Tea was served with painful formality. Victoria made small talk about her travels, her father's business ventures, mutual acquaintances from before Samuel's accident. She carefully avoided mentioning their broken engagement or the circumstances of their parting. "Your home is charming," Victoria said, glancing around the parlor with a poorly concealed assessment. "Quite rustic. It's functional," Samuel replied. "Everything has its place, nothing unnecessary." "That's what I need." "Yes, I suppose practical considerations are paramount now." Victoria's eyes slid to Margaret. "Mrs. Hartwell, I understand you manage the ranch's administrative affairs." "I do. Bookkeeping, correspondence, contracts, financial planning." "How modern of you." The compliment felt like an insult. Most wives wouldn't have the head for such things. Most wives aren't partners in a working ranch. Margaret met Victoria's gaze steadily. "Samuel and I built our marriage on mutual respect and shared responsibility. It works well for us." Victoria's smile tightened. "Of course. Though I imagine there are aspects of married life that require more than just business partnership." The implication hung in the air. Margaret felt anger rise, but kept her voice level. "Our marriage is exactly what we need it to be." Which is more than can be said for many conventional arrangements. Samuel's hand found Margaret's, his fingers interlacing with hers in a gesture of clear solidarity. "Victoria, why are you really here?" The directness seemed to catch Victoria off guard. She set down her teacup with a delicate clink. "I wanted to see you. To know that you'd found happiness, did you? Or did you want to confirm that leaving me was the right decision? That you didn't miss out on anything important?" Victoria's composure cracked. "That's not fair, Samuel. You can't possibly understand how impossible the situation was. Everyone pitied me, the poor girl whose fiancé went blind. They expected me to sacrifice my entire future out of obligation. No one expected you to sacrifice anything, Samuel said quietly. What I needed was honesty. Instead, you waited 2 weeks before breaking our engagement with a formal letter, as if I were a business contract being dissolved. I was young and frightened, and I didn't know what else to do. Victoria's voice rose. You were bitter and angry and impossible to reach. Every time I tried to visit, you sent me away, because I could hear the pity in your voice. I could feel your relief every time you left. Samuel's face was hard. You didn't love me enough to face hardship together. That's fine. Not everyone is built for that kind of challenge. But don't rewrite history now and pretend you were the victim. Victoria stood abruptly. I should go. This was clearly a mistake. Wait. Margaret spoke up, surprising herself. Miss Brennan, I understand why you left. You wanted a certain kind of life, and Samuel couldn't provide it anymore. That's honest, even if it was painful. She stood facing Victoria directly. But you need to understand something. Samuel didn't need rescuing. He didn't need pity. What he needed was a partner who saw his worth beyond what he could see with his own eyes. I'm not a consolation prize or a desperate choice. I'm exactly the right wife for him, because I value what matters. Victoria stared at Margaret, her beautiful face reflecting a complicated mix of emotions. Shame, anger, regret, and something that might have been grudging respect. You're very brave. Or very foolish. I haven't decided which. Perhaps both, Margaret said. But I'm happy. Can you say the same? The question landed like a stone in still water. Victoria's carefully constructed composure finally shattered. No, she whispered. I married a railroad executive last year. He's wealthy and successful and gives me everything I wanted. But he sees me as an ornament, not a person. I'm decorative wife number 3, expected to smile and look pretty and never have an opinion about anything that matters. The admission hung in the air. Samuel's expression softened slightly. I'm sorry you're unhappy, Victoria, truly, but that doesn't change anything between us. That chapter of my life is closed. Victoria nodded, wiping discreetly at her eyes. I know. I think I needed to see that you'd moved on, that you'd built something real. She looked at Margaret. Take care of him. He deserves someone who sees his worth. I know he does. That's why I married him. After Victoria's carriage disappeared down the drive, Margaret and Samuel stood on the porch in silence. Finally, Samuel spoke. Thank you. For what? For defending our marriage. For seeing what she couldn't. He pulled Margaret close, his arms warm around her despite the cold. I meant what I said before. This marriage works. But I realized something today. It's become more than just practical partnership. Margaret felt her heart hammer. What do you mean? I mean, I've grown to care for you, not because you're convenient or useful, but because you're brave and clever and honest, and you make me laugh when I'm being too serious. Samuel's hand found her face, tracing the familiar landscape of scars. I know this wasn't what either of us expected, but I'm grateful for it. For you. Margaret leaned into his touch, feeling tears prick her eyes. I care for you too. More than I thought possible when we started this arrangement. Then perhaps we should stop calling it an arrangement and start calling it what it's become. What's that? A real marriage. With all the complications and joys that entails. The kiss they shared was witnessed by Ruth through the kitchen window. The housekeeper smiled to herself and went back to her work, satisfied that her employer had finally found what he needed. That evening, the ranch hands gathered for dinner, the atmosphere lighter than usual. Jack raised his coffee cup in a toast to Mrs. Hartwell, who sent that fancy lady packing with her tail between her legs. That was something to see. You were watching? Margaret asked, mortified. We all were, Tom admitted with a grin. Couldn't hear the words, but we saw enough. You stood up to her like a ranch wife should. She showed proper spirit, Salty Pete added. Takes a strong woman to face down her husband's past without flinching. Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest. She'd earned their respect through hard work, but this was different. This was acceptance. She wasn't just the boss's wife anymore. She was one of them, part of the ranch community. As winter deepened into January, Margaret and Samuel's partnership evolved into genuine companionship. They worked side by side, managing the ranch through the hardest months. When a late-season blizzard threatened the herd, they spent 72 hours in the barn, ensuring every animal survived. When a buyer tried to cheat them on a cattle contract, Margaret's careful bookkeeping proved their case and secured fair payment. They also learned about each other's bodies and hearts. Samuel taught Margaret that intimacy didn't require sight, that touch and sound and trust created their own language. Margaret taught Samuel that scars were just skin, that beauty had nothing to do with symmetry and everything to do with spirit. One February morning, as they sat together watching the sunrise Samuel couldn't see, Margaret realized something profound. She was happy. Genuinely, completely happy in a way she'd never imagined possible. "What are you thinking?" Samuel asked, his arm around her shoulders. "That my father was wrong about everything. I'm not too ugly to marry. I'm not a burden. I'm not a mistake that needs fixing." Margaret leaned her head against his shoulder. "I'm exactly who I'm supposed to be, married to exactly who I'm supposed to be with." "Your father's an idiot." "Yes, he is," Margaret smiled. "But I'm grateful for his cruelty in a strange way. If he'd been kinder, I might never have been desperate enough to accept your proposal. And then I would have missed this, missed you, missed this life, missed discovering who I could be when someone actually believed in me." Samuel turned to face her, his hands framing her face. "I don't believe in you, Margaret. I know you. Know your strength, your intelligence, your loyalty. Those aren't matters of belief, they're facts." "I love you," Margaret said, the words surprising her with their simplicity and truth. Samuel's smile was brilliant. "I love you too," which was not part of our original agreement. But I'm finding I don't care much about terms and conditions anymore. In the distance, cattle lowed their morning greeting. Ranch hands began their daily routines. Ruth started breakfast preparations, muttering about men and their appetites. The Double H Ranch woke to another day of hard work and simple joys, and Margaret Hartwell, once told she was too ugly to marry, stood in her husband's arms and knew she was exactly where she belonged, not despite her scars, but complete with them. Not as a compromise or a consolation, but as a true partner in a life built on honesty, respect, and unexpected love. Her father had been wrong about her worth. Victoria had been wrong about what mattered in a marriage. But Samuel, blind, stubborn, wonderful Samuel, had seen the truth all along. Sometimes the best kind of seeing happens without eyes at all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.